Now, U.S. lawmakers and President Obama continue to haggle over the 2011 budget cuts. They cannot agree, and a government shutdown looms. Now, this has been one of the top doom and gloom stories on the mainstream media for days now, and the president's getting into it too, telling the public about the cost of a showdown. Take a look.
You better start thinking differently because, you know, like if you need a passport, can't get it done. Planning a visit to a national park or monument? Too bad, can't get there.
Contingency plans for the shutdown have been made. Meanwhile, Capitol Hill appears to be in chaos.
This has not happened in 15 years.
What does this potentially mean for the American people at a time when the economy is just beginning to grow, where we're just starting to see a pickup in employment? The last thing we need is a disruption that's caused by a government shutdown.
So here's our question. Is this really the big deal everyone is making it out to be? Well, joining me to answer that, hopefully, is economist and financial analyst Fraad Wolff, joining us from New York. Now, Max, from the analysis I'm looking at today, global markets don't expect a shutdown to last more than a few days. The U.S. Treasury will continue to hold debt sales, so continuing to finance its operations. And, I mean, aside from closing a few parks and maybe a few days off work for people, it doesn't seem like it's the doom and gloom scenario it's being made into. Am I wrong?
No, I mean, I think it may be being slightly blown out of proportion. At some point, some of these news stories are all but suggesting people stock up on shotgun shells, water, and flashlights, and of course that's fairly ridiculous in a number of ways. I think there's still a very good chance that we'll see a last-minute deal tomorrow, and or we'll see them kick the can down the road, because that has been a pastime on budgetary matters in Washington for a long time, and do another stopgap that gives them another 7 or 8 days. I think the symbolic value about the lack of compromise, the lack of ability to work together, and the fierce fighting over symbolic positions ahead of the election cycle for 2012 is probably more alarming and more something for people to worry about, even than the government being shut down for a day or two, which I still think is in no way a sure thing.
Well, it's interesting, and it's an interesting point you make about symbolism, because I want to look at even what these cuts are that they're debating right now. I do believe we have a graphic that shows what portion of the budget this is, if we could bring that up. It's just, when you look at the pie of the budget, it is such a small portion that they're looking at. Well, these are the things that actually it would mean if there was a shutdown in there. You know, parks, passports wouldn't be issued, those kind of things. That's kind of what the media is playing up. But I want to look at what's not being discussed, and that's how small this portion of cuts is of the actual budget. And Max, my question to you, obviously you can't see it, but the 30-some billion dollars that they're arguing over is a tiny piece of the pie. Does this argument and the gridlock that it's doing,
9 days.
Yeah, does this take away from the debate
9 days worth of our budget deficit?
Yeah, that's nothing. That's nothing. Does this take away from the bigger picture, which is the toll of our debt, the continuing borrowing, the continuing spending, the fixes like quantitative easing that come at a really high cost?
Well, it's a little bit of a dress rehearsal for what are going to be bigger, massive fights about the $4 trillion 2012 budget, and also how to respond to the debt ceiling, the $14 trillion debt ceiling that we're about to go crashing through. And unlike many other ceilings, that's not a ceiling you want to really go through. That's not something we should have ever been forced into the situation of having to debate like we are right now. I do think that part of the reason we're seeing this much fighting over it is because it's pretty clear that the Republican Party at the federal, state, and local level is going to run as the budget-cutting party in 2012 for state houses and Senate seats and House seats in the presidency, and this keeps them front and center in the news on that subject. In terms of the $30 to $40 billion that they're fighting over here, it's 9 or 10 days of budget deficit, so it's a very small number given the $4 trillion government budget we're going to have for next fiscal year 2012. On the other hand, because we never really deal with or touch the 89% of the budget that's non-discretionary, it's a bigger piece of the discretionary spending, and both sides have larded up their proposals with ideological things to excite their bases, which are making compromise impossible, which is going to have a pretty significant symbolic value, if nothing else. And I would also add that most people aren't covering, but it depends on how long the government stays down, how big of a deal it is. If it shuts down for a day and resumes, that's one thing. If this gets worse and worse and the impasse cascades over several days, then we're going to have a slightly different thing we need to debate here on your and other shows.
Right, and really quickly, I want to ask, because you talked about the debt ceiling, isn't that a bigger debate that's just down the road that's a lot more important? I mean, if they can't get that debt ceiling higher, I mean, that's when the U.S. would actually default on debt. I mean, that's what's at stake there. It's much bigger of a deal, right?
Well, if they couldn't actually get the debt ceiling raised, which I think is fairly improbable, a little bit like not being able to get a budget, then what you'd actually have, not so much as the United States defaulting on debt, but you'd have a situation in which massive emergency cuts would be made in a helter-skelter, disorganized fashion. And that's what everyone wants to avoid, because no matter what your ideological commitments are, having a dysfunctional and disorganized American government on display for the world for many days and in many ways is the worst possible outcome, whatever your priorities for the budget might be for the years to come.